You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Martin Davidson. You'll be able to tell by his accent that he's not from Indiana. Mr. Davidson has 2 degrees from Oxford University and worked at J. Walter Thompson. I'll have to ask him if he was friends with H.R. Haldeman. Before becoming a filmmaker and author, specializing in historical and cultural subjects, he was an executive producer on several historical films and documentaries. He is a well-recognized, reviewed expert on Nazi Germany, The Final Solution, and wrote a terrific book about how it's impacted his family in a way that he perhaps could never have predicted. Mr. Davidson, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
You're welcome. I actually have interviewed more than one person who worked at J. Walter Thompson, the famous public relations firm. Unfortunately, I didn't get to interview H.R. Haldeman, who worked there in the 60s before going to work for Nixon. But Dwight Chapin came on the podcast, and he's an alum. Thank you for chronicling, for writing the way you do, like you do. It's no holds barred, but it's very personal. And we're going to get to that part of the interview at the end. But so much about the state of Israel, the treatment of the Jewish people, all that stuff is in the news. It's one of the reasons I reached out to you here in January of 2024. When did you start studying the Holocaust, or studying Germany and the Holocaust? And what was it about that drew you to such what is clearly a dreary subject?
It's the darkest of all subjects, and once it gets you in its gravitational pull, it's very difficult to achieve escape velocity, because one question leads to another, and each becomes more grave, more grievous, more challenging than the one before. But the spark of my interest, I'm a graduate student, as you pointed out, I have 2 degrees from Oxford, but actually they were in literature rather than history. So it took a long time for me to get round to this subject, but rather paradoxically, the main trigger was a family trigger. And you mentioned in the introduction, I was in a position to discover I have a German mother. And in the early 90s, I came to discover that her father, who had just died, who died at the age of 86 in 1982, having been born in 1906, I met him several times. I knew of him and knew him, and had worked his life in West Germany, in West Berlin, as a dentist. It then turned out had not been, as had been often described to me, merely a conscripted soldier forced to wear the German uniform in the war, but had, in fact, au contraire, had been a volunteer member of the SS, had been an officer in the SS, a Hauptsturmführer, which is the rank of captain, the same rank that Armand Goeth has in Schindler's List in the movie. You can imagine that rather caught me by surprise, took my breath away. and began a 10-year dalliance with would I ever investigate further. And finally, I couldn't bear it anymore. During this time, I was working both for the BBC in Britain, but also for the Discovery Channel, History Channel, PBS in America via co-productions on a lot of historical documentaries. But skirting around a bit like water going round and round at the bottom of a plug hole. And I knew this thing was sucking me in. And I finally relented a few years back in the early years of the new century to investigate what this man had done, who he was, to piece together, if you like, a Nazi CV. Who was this man, my grandfather? And that spawned an interest in the perpetrator. I was very interested in who these people were and what they could possibly have been thinking. I grew up in Britain very much as a Brit. I was born in 1960. So I lived through the great golden age of World War II war movies and the incredible kind of perfectly, in my mind, morally justified triumphalism with which those movies were marinated. They told a very epic, and when I say one-sided, quite rightly one-sided, there was nothing ambiguous or ambivalent about the war that we fought. When I say we, the great allied nations of the world that made it their mission to do whatever it took to stop this regime and everything it stood for in its tracks. So I had grown up in that world and I had completely identified myself entirely with the winning side. That's who I would have been if you play that game that I think a lot of us play, which is, had I been born 30 years earlier, what would I have done in the war? And the answer is obvious. I'd have flown that P-51 Mustang. I'd have been on the bridge of that destroyer. There was no question I was on the winning side. And now to discover, even though I had German family and visited Berlin lots, I was aware that my relationship to the subject was more tentative than might have been the case with my compatriots. It was on discovering what my grandfather had done that it really came, the chicken came home to roost. And I thought, so the question here is not what would you have done if you'd been born 35 years earlier. If you'd been born 35 years earlier in Germany, the question would have been, would you have had the courage not to do it? So that's where it started. And the latest book I wrote on the Holocaust itself had that as one of its triggers. I wrote this book about my German grandfather, came out in 2010, published in America and in Britain under the title The Perfect Nazi, which is what I discovered he was. And this latter book, Mobilizing Hate, which is a story of the Holocaust, Hitler's final solution, was an attempt to it had its roots in a television series. I was part of a team making a television series actually for German television, rather interestingly. And I was given 2 films to make on the Holocaust. And I just found myself drawn back into that subject, haunted and tormented by the same questions, not so much directly my grandfather, but what were people like him? What was it all about? What made them do it? And there was one particular terrible question that was the genesis of the book, which I dared to ask in the sense that normally when you think about the Holocaust, there is a sense in which it was German, a German mentality gone mad. It was like the strapline for the famous Audi German car commercials. I don't know if you had them in America, but in Europe, it was, they used this phrase, Vorsprung durch Technik, the jump ahead through technology. And that was a sort of a clever read of a German idea, which would have been rather distasteful to have done, but suddenly equated a feeling we had in the 90s that German technology was very cool with its BMWs and its Audis. But there was a sense in which the Holocaust, you sometimes think this is German industrial rationality gone mad. And I flipped that and I asked the question, what if the Holocaust had its roots in emotions that actually felt good? What if what we're looking for is the most troubling impulse of all? Here was a mindset that actually rewarded those who believed in it with feelings of empowerment and pleasure and self-satisfaction. And that was the trigger for the book. And I wrote it to explore that idea. That was the genesis of it.
Let's jump right into your book. It's fascinating. Mobilizing Hate, the story of Hitler's final solution. You could have chosen any title, or you could have paired any word with hate. Why did you choose mobilizing as opposed to abetting or understanding?
It was a very deliberate choice. I talk about standing on the shoulders of giants. This is a subject that has attracted the intellectual, the historical, the moral imaginations and intellects of some of the greatest writers and historians and thinkers of the last century and a half. It's ever since anyone started thinking about it, this is a subject that has attracted extraordinary minds. So I come along very modestly and humbly as somebody who is trying to, if you like, add a footnote to the great mountains of scholarship that have been done. So most of those books, quite rightly, have this idea that what the Nazis did to the Jewish people, the 6 million out of the 13 million or so we now estimate of numbers of civilians that the Germans whom the Germans killed, or were casualties of the German war effort in World War II. There's 6 million who were targeted for a very particular kind of persecution, misery, and final destruction. What I wanted to get hold of was that this was not collateral damage. This was not something that grew in spite of itself. This was a project that was conceived, planned, rationalized, implemented, and drawn gratification from in a really deliberate way. And this is what the book tries to explore, is by what process do you move in understanding this story from its embryonic beginnings in the minds of a small number of ultra-nationalist extremists in Germany in the months and years immediately after the First World War, and how does it grow exponentially, first of all, into an idea that has the power to those who are infected by it to appear able to explain everything, all of human history, past, present, and future. How do you take that idea and turn it into the moral compass of a political movement? How then do you, on achieving political power, take those ideas and build a regime around them? And then how, when war is started, how do you take that idea forward into its last two kind of manifestations as a principle with which you fight the war? And lastly, when the war becomes both continental and global, how do you make that idea about who and what the Jews are and what they represent a reason, a kind of motive for fighting a kind of a monumental genocidal war of annihilation? So it's to follow if you like, this telescopic progression from idea to politics, to a regime, to war, to continental war. What were the elements that gave this idea, which is what it was, that kind of toxic power, and who was responsible at each of those moments in pushing it through from one definition to another and helping it achieve the scale and momentum and irresistibility that it needed to have in order to produce what it ended up producing, namely the final solution. So that was the title, because most books on the subject will use a version of the word the Holocaust, a post-war coinage, or the ironic inversion of what the Nazis call it, the final solution. And those titles hang there, likely huge, as big as the subject. And I wanted to do something that sort of chiseled its way underneath that, said, no, what's at work here was a process. And it was a process that it was like embers. They were deliberately blown and inflamed and rationalized and made to work. That was the idea of the title.
So much of the discussion about the origins of the Holocaust, we only have an hour and a few minutes here on the Leaders and Legends podcast, so I don't want to go back to ancient times, for lack of a better term. But so much of it, and you mentioned this in your book and others have as well, the German reaction to losing World War I, or at the time, the Great War, and the role it played in catalyzing this hate into action. I've always said on these podcasts, when I've talked to other historians, the connections or the parallels between the reaction of the Confederate States of America in the American South to losing the Civil War and what came afterward, and the reaction to ordinary Germans to losing the Great War and then what came after. If I ever get my PhD, that's what I would love to write about, because there are a lot of parallels But the Germans just simply could not believe they lost that war. They had the strongest army. They had incredible industrial might. But as Ludendorff said one time, the German quartermaster general, we cannot fight the entire world. They did, and they lost. What was in a short period of time, what was the German mentality after losing World War I and having to sign the Treaty of Versailles?
It's such a widely held idea, and I believe it's a completely valid one. This would never have happened without the First World War. The First World War, the Great War, is the absolutely only begetter. It's inconceivable that this would have happened without it. And I think the way to understand it is to start off with the idea it's different. There's a difference between losing a war and losing a world war. And what a world war has at its basis is the idea that the victor will emerge not just as they had in the Franco-Prussian War, all these other wars that had happened before, when a border gets moved a bit, or some tribute gets to be paid, or a few colonies get added to the imperial collective. What a world war promises is a one-step leapfrog from being one among many nations to being a world leader. This is the extraordinary thing about the First World War is nobody ever really quite understands why it started. So it started as a consequence of a series of accidents. But once they started fighting it, they really meant to win. And what the Germans wanted to win was an achievement, if you like. This was going to catapult the German nation from the bottom of the European pile to the top. And back in this period, Europe is the great crucible of power in the world. America is on its way, but it hasn't yet arrived. This is an imperial project. What victory will give the Germans is something that the French, the British, especially the British, the Spanish, the Portuguese have all had before, which is a kind of global hegemony, a grip, a superpower status across the globe. And this is what the Germans, but they've had it taken away from them. And what made that defeat crushing and demoralizing for particularly a hardcore of ultra-nationalists was one, as has often been observed, it was the nature, not a shot fired on German soil. The German military leadership threw in the towel without telling anyone. And then they made the politicians sign the armistice to blame them. But to make it worse, that part of the German success in the First World War that most people don't really quite clock is what happened on the Eastern Front. So the Germans wipe out, the Russian army gives up and signs this Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, which hands Germany control of most of Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Belarus, an extraordinary amount of land. And what happens in Russia, of course, is that all collapses around the Bolshevik Revolution. So Russia is now consumed by internal politics. And Germany has this Eastern Empire, sends 1 million troops west to wipe out the Western Front, and fails. And nobody can believe it. But I think you have to understand the effect of 1919 is what I call it. It's the 4 horsemen of the German apocalypse. 4 things happen, all of which have tremendously damaging effect on Germany in very quick session. One is the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and the invention of communism, which the Germans use as a war winning. That's great. It's taken Russia out of the war. But you've opened the stable door to an ideological virus that's going to come back in and attack Germany. So the spectre of communism is now something that threatens Germany. The second thing that, of course, is the armistice, which nobody can understand. We weren't defeated, and you've signed surrender. The third thing is the setting up of the Weimar Republic, which is a liberal, left-leaning democracy out of one of the most right-wing imperialist Reich that's ever existed. Imagine having to flip like that in the space of 48 hours. And the fourth thing, as you say, as everybody knows, the final coup d'etat, nail in the coffin, is the Treaty of Versailles, which suddenly confirms every worst German fear that, as far as the world is concerned, Germany is now the ultimate pariah. Not only did they fail to achieve what a world war would have delivered, which is namely a kind of global superpower importance, they're at the bottom of the heap. Any one of their great power rivals can now dictate any condition they like. Army, yep, you can have one, but it's only 100,000. Reparations in the billions. We'll military occupy the Ruhr Valley to make sure that you pay. And out of that, starts to form in a way that's probably only too understandable among, and it has to be stressed, a small minority at this point of battle-scarred, traumatized men who just cannot believe that they have had all their dreams dashed and taken away across the border. So it's not just they've lost the war, they've lost Germany. And we know it's in the mind of one particular man, Adolf Hitler, where these thoughts start to gel with particularly virulent power. And from that, he stitches together a whole theory about, in order to explain this, there's no point looking, well, the great powers had better tanks or the great powers were better led. He goes for an explanation that goes way beyond, that takes into account the shape of the modern world, which is now dominated by the American capitalist West, British imperial, French imperialism, and Soviet communism. That's what the world, the only way you can understand the world is by taking a lens as big as these ideas. Where do they leave Germany? And what gets born bizarrely, because it played no role in the causes of the First World War, the way the First World War was fought, or even the identity of 100,000 of Germany's soldiers, is the Jewish question. And out of this rubble of searching for an explanation starts to emerge, Germany was the victim of two great forces. One, this new type of ideology that you've seen in the form of communism. And secondly, international finance in the form of stock markets and money and capital. And in this bizarre conflation of what for most of us seem like the opposite ends of the pole, you don't think of Wall Street bankers being the same as red anarchists in Moscow. The Germans start to go, they're the same people. We are the victims of a conspiracy, a new way of understanding how the world is no longer run by the men in top hats and the aristocrats and the diplomats and the powers. There is at work here in the world, a new alliance of how, if you like, a new world order, a new agency in the world. And we're just beginning to see its definite outlines forming in the mist. And it takes Hitler 5 years between 1919 and 1924 to decide what form that takes. And in his head is spawned the idea that the world is now at the mercy of a new invisible force. And the thing about anti-Semitism,
I was just getting ready to ask. I was just getting ready to ask you about that. Let me stop just a second. I had a professor. We're talking with historian and documentarian Martin Davidson, who's very kind to Zoom over from the mother country to have this conversation. I had a political science professor. Her name was Roseanne Rothman, Jewish, and we would have lunch, especially after I graduated, and we would talk about anti-Semitism, because as much as I try in my history readings to understand anti-Semitism, I don't want to go back to the crucifixion. I find it hard. It's easy to understand. It's easy to define, but hard to understand in my view. And you have instances in European history where anti-Semitism rears its head. Is it 1290? Edward I kicks all the Jews out of England because he doesn't feel like paying them back the money that they had loaned them.
Exactly. And that's the first use of the word Holocaust in an English chronicle, Holocaustum. That's the first time that word is used in connection with an action of mass cruelty against the Jews.
And then I read a book called Disease in History. I read it probably 30 years ago. And the book made the argument that one of the reasons, and please comment on this argument as I lead you into a discussion about anti-Semitism, but one of the reasons why Hitler had these millions of Jewish people at his disposal to massacre was related to the Black Death, and how during the bubonic plague and the Black Death, since it was prevalent in the cities, the leaders at the time, religious and secular, blamed the Jews because they were primarily traders, and they pushed them all inland away from the harbor towns and harbor cities, trading cities. So 600 years later, when Hitler goes on his rampage, he's got this big fat pocket of Jewish people who 600 years ago had lived in seaports, but they were responsible for the Black Death. It's anti-Semitism. It's a thread through history. Obviously, no one took it as far as Hitler. But instead of centering on the Jewish population, could Hitler have mass blamed another demographic group and gotten the same reaction?
The Black Death theory is interesting. I've not heard it before. I certainly know that there were the Black Death. In the wake of the Black Death, there were endless pogroms because in any moment of plague or pestilence, communities will lash out at the usual culprits. The idea that was the reason that so much of the Jewish population in Europe would have amalgamated, particularly in Poland, I hadn't thought of. I think the way to understand it is that what Hitler is looking, or what's happening in his mind. And I do think it's Hitler. I think he's not the only one who thinks like this, but I think he is the great mobilizer. He is the great catalyst, without whom none of this would have happened. So I realize in historiographical terms, it's quite old-fashioned to put the spotlight so much on Hitler. It's become much more fashionable to spread the load of blame. But I think for the purposes of shorthand and for the purposes of my book, I think it still feels valid to me. And what you have in his mind is there is the look for an explanation of what's gone wrong, an explanation of how the world works. And I think the way I look at it is that what gets concocted in Hitler's mind is what I would call a kind of racism plus. So racism is the usual way in which the great imperial powers of the early 20th century justified their empires. And in that case, it was very easy to do. That racism was quite literal and quite straightforward. The British were better than the brown peoples that they conquered. The Americans were better than the Native Americans that they slaughtered. This is replicated, and the mindset was a brutal and reductive one. But what you get with Hitler and the Jews, of course, is that doesn't work, because what makes the Jewish menace so present in the mind of an anti-Semite is these are the people who run the world. They are more cosmopolitan, more sophisticated than the everyday European citizen. They've invented these ideologies. So communism and Bolshevism is identified entirely with the Jewish mind. The Jewish mind is associated with all sorts of revolutionary movements, revolutionary spirits, but it is also identified with the economy, with the media, with international finance. These are the most sophisticated tools with which the modern world organizes itself. And all of them are, in the mind of an anti-Semite, being pulled together, being tarnished, being toxified by the same, what I call the biggest non sequitur in history, the most grotesque non sequitur in history, that this is somehow a Jewish product and therefore a way of understanding Judaism, and not just of some Jews, but all Jews. That's the extraordinary leap that gets made. And the way I try to understand it is, I explain in the book, I think what happens in Hitler's mind is that there are three definitions of who the anti-Semitically framed idea of who the Jew is. There are three different headings. One is the eternal Jew. And it's terrible. I'm air quoting like mad because you have to put
we understand. We understand.
The Nazi use of that word is so obviously loaded and toxic. And that figure is a figure around whom congregates a whole language of disgusting language of parasite behavior to bacteria, medicine, pathogens, all sorts of imagery that's both disgusting and designed to be loathsome. But there's a second heading, and that is Judaism. And although to the anti-Semite, the Jewish people are defined by race, not by religion, nevertheless, there is the 2,000-year story of not only, first of all, the Christ-killing thing, but also in its more modern incarnation, the idea that it's very powerful to the Germans that the Jewish presence in the world is an antithetical to and inimical towards authentic European culture. This is a culture war, and that Judaism stands accused as an ism, as itself being a contaminant, a nefarious opponent of European high civilization. But the third and the most potent is the modern phrase, which is that the Germans or anti-Semites start to conceive of the idea of what they call world Jewry. And world Jewry is this formulation that there exists this cabal, this network of insinuated people who have their hands on power but won't declare it. They don't fly a flag, they don't wear a uniform, but everywhere you want to look, all the important levers of the modern world, the economic, the media, the financial, the ideological, the cultural, have one way or another fallen under the power of Jews. And the idea of world Jewry, these are the people who actually Hitler will rail against most. The idea of all that idea of the parasitical mole, the toxin bearing, verminous, all that horror stuff is definitely something that preoccupies the mind of the Nazi anti-Semite, as does hatred for everything that Jewish culture stands for in its anti-Christian, anti-European civilization mode. But it's world Jewry that scares them, because it's world Jewry that has taken control of the Kremlin, Downing Street, the White House. And one of the things I target later is there's an extraordinary moment towards the end of 1941, when it looks more and more like America is coming closer and closer to joining the war. And you've had Churchill steaming across the Atlantic to meet FDR in August 1941 and they promulgate this thing called the Atlantic Charter, 8 very high-minded principles of freedom and self-determination that stand opposed to everything that Nazism stands for. And at that point, Churchill cannot persuade Roosevelt to join the war. They share war aims, but FDR is still enthralled to the Neutrality Acts. He's not going to, but it's very clear where his sympathies lie. And what is it that happens in August the 14th? And what's instant that happens in Germany is Hitler is terrified. Hitler is absolutely appalled by this apparition of Britain, the Soviet Union, and now America appearing to form the basis of a coalition. And this was never supposed to happen. Soviet Bolsheviks, British imperialists, and American plutocrats have nothing in common. They should be at each other's throats. And yet, despite everything, it looks like they are now building a coalition, and they dare to imagine a post-Nazi world, which is what you get in the Atlantic Charter, this vision of a world stripped of the Nazi scourge. And German propaganda changes instantly. So up till that point, all the appalling, loathsome imagery that the Nazis have used to demonize their Jewish populations, the rats, the vermin, the tuberculosis bacteria, all that revolting stuff. Suddenly, we're now in a world where it's the spider and the octopus, it's the web, it's the whispering Jew behind the curtain, the puppeteer, and all the world leaders. So you have this moment where Hitler is convinced that the real enemy in World War II, the moment the war goes truly global, which it does in December 1941 after Pearl Harbor, and America is now in the war, the Soviet Union, instead of being defeated in 6 weeks like it was supposed to, is holding on. And it's now Germany that's reached the end of its supply lines and is now stalled in the snow of the East. And it's all starting to fray around the edges. And that's the moment where Hitler goes, I was right. All along, I told you, we weren't fighting the great powers of the First World War. We were fighting their puppet masters, who have now been revealed in all their transparencies, having been world Jewry. And I think he really believed that. I don't think he's just saying that for effect. And that's the point where the acceleration in the persecution of the Jews really starts to gather force and pace. From August 1941, that rhetoric becomes real. And it's no coincidence that it was a month later that they were supposed to have their Wannsee conference, that infamous, what I call the most infamous working lunch in history, when for 90 minutes, senior Nazi bureaucrats gathered round to put the rubber stamp on making the final solution kind of official and streamlined. And that was supposed to happen in December, but Pearl Harbor obviously intervened, and so it gets postponed till January. But that is the real moment. And I think that transition in terms of who Hitler thinks he's fighting, and that's the point where you look at the war and you just can't understand. You've got a war to fight. You're now fighting the entire rest of the industrial world and you're killing Jews. Are you insane? Not just for wanting to do it in the first place, but just at the level of sheer military pragmatism. What are you doing? And that is to fail to understand that Hitler is, as are the Nazis, are completely convinced that everything they've been saying about the Nazi threat since 1919 has now been grotesquely vindicated. And it's why it's this idea of world Jewry, as opposed to just the Jew and Judaism, that now takes priority in their view, and why the final solution ramps up through beginning of 1942 into post the summer of 42. And the extraordinary, I hadn't fully grasped this when I started writing this. You know the figure 6 million killed. 3 million of them are killed by the end of 1942. It's so early. You think that can't, but I thought, what, Auschwitz? I thought this was going, it took years to do this. And I said, this is just one of the key moments that I try and track in the book. What led up to this moment? What are the circumstances? How can a meeting between Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, and FDR, the American president, in a bay in Newfoundland, how can that be itself a trigger for this extraordinary moment of acceleration that happens between August and September 1941? Because the other thing that happens is that's when Hitler goes, that's it for Jews inside the Reich itself. And then September the 17th, the Yellow Star is announced. So every single Jew still living in Germany now has to wear a yellow star, and the transports begin. He doesn't care. There's nowhere to send them to. Does not care. But the last people who are going to benefit from the fact that Germany is now beginning to get rocked badly by a war slipping through its fingers are the Jews in Germany, and they will be the first to pay the price. So what the book tries to do is try to understand that all this ideology and all this warped thinking that has spent 20 years germinating and being mobilized in Nazi minds is indistinguishable from the war effort. That one is not a sort of collateral, peripheral side issue to the other. They are one and the same. And the way the clock ticks and we move into 1942, into 1943 is really terrifying.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our guest today is Martin Davidson, who's kind enough to zoom over from Great Britain. We were discussing his book. It's absolutely phenomenal. It's called Mobilizing Hate, the story of Hitler's final solution. Mr. Davidson, what did you think of the movie Schindler's List?
I thought it was extraordinary. I saw it when it came out in 1993, and to circle back to the personal story I was telling you at the start, it was only a month or two after my German grandfather died. So the film came out, I think I saw early 93, and he died at the end of 92. So I went to see it actually with my sister in New York, where we happened to be. I was there for BBC work. I was in New York. I mean, the best city in the world to go and see a film like this, and absolutely blew away the both of us. We sat there unable to move at the end of it because we had, I don't mean to sound melodramatic, but the depiction in the early scenes of those German Nazi officers cavorting and wassailing and drinking in that nightclub, that Polish nightclub at the beginning, because they've got the whole world at their feet and they feel they're on the brink of this extraordinary, this consummation of this German war that's going to deliver them the kind of the empire and the world status that they've craved all their lives. And we were just going, that's our grandfather. That's just our grandfather. And there's just a tiny little anecdote, I would say, because I discovered, as I say, that my German grandfather had been in the SS. And I remember my mother, the only thing she knew, she said he was a Hauptsturmführer. And I remember thinking, I don't know, what the hell is that? I have no idea. I didn't know anything about SS ranks. So I looked it up and I thought it was a captain. And halfway through Schindler's List, at the beginning of the film, Armand Gert, who is the commandant of Plaszow labor camp, played by Ralph Fiennes, one of the most chilling performances I've ever seen, just a work of theatrical genius. And he arrives in his open-top Kubelwagen, and he's there to inspect the ghetto. And the caption comes up and it says, Untersturmführer Armand Gert. And I thought, what the hell, what's an Untersturm, whatever? And then I looked it up, and that's a second lieutenant, Untersturmführer. And he has, I could tell by this point, because I looked it up, you could tell by his collar pips what rank he was. In Schindler's Ark, the Thomas Kennerly book, there's a description of how Himmler, head of the SS, is so impressed by what Armand Gert has done at Plaszow labor camp that he promotes him 2 ranks in one go. Untersturmführer to Obersturmführer, first lieutenant to Hauptsturmführer, captain. Now, this is not mentioned in the movie, but halfway through the movie, those of us who've now got the eyes to see it, Ralph Fiennes' uniform changes. And you can see his collar now has 3 pips and 2 lines, which is the rank of Hauptsturmführer. And I leant over to my sister at the time and said, "Oh, Christ, that's Bruno." Bruno was the name of my German grandfather, Bruno Lampein. That was Bruno's rank. So we then got this sort of horrified feeling of, this man has just been promoted to the same rank as our grandfather was, and he's running an entire camp. And that was my first kind of shocking realization that the ranking system in the SS during the Nazi period is all about what job you did. It's not in any other context. If you said, my grandfather fought in the American Army Air Force and he was a captain, you think that's quite senior, but it's not policy deciding senior. It's not major general or lieutenant colonel.
Or genocide. It's not genocide rank.
No, except it turns out that it is. And it's the same rank we then, Joseph Mengele, the infamous Auschwitz doctor, he's a Hauptsturmführer. Leon Barbie, Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon. And that was, so for us, Schindler's List, I still think is one of the great movies. I know it has been accused of being a bit sentimental. And I think there's something about the ending. I find when I watch it now, I stop watching it just before it gets right to the end. And there's that moment when Schindler takes off his Nazi party badge and he says, "If only I'd sold this, I could have. And actually that's wrong. That Schindler, in order to have that badge, and the reason I know this is because Bruno, my grandfather, had one. So the photograph we have of him, he's wearing the gold honor badge, that little round swastika thing.
Oh, and that means you were a supporter at the beginning.
Yeah. You had to have a party number of under 100,000 to earn that. And my German grandfather, Bruno, joined the Nazi party in 1926 at the age of 18 with a party number of 38,000. So he had this badge. And I remember asking a German historian, I said, "Did that badge mean anything? What's its significance?" He said, "It meant everything. It meant first to the queue, first to the line, any line, VIP seats at any meeting. And you know damn well, walking up the sidewalk of a German street, people, if they knew what they were about, would be getting out of your way." And he said they loved it. They would have adored it. And my sister and I agreed that what we remember of what kind of person Bruno was, he would have absolutely adored the prestige, the kind of charisma that having that badge entailed. And Schindler, the whole point about Schindler was he's slow to his awakening. He's not a Nazi supporter. He would never have had that badge. So I remember thinking both for reasons of sentimentality and historical accuracy, that final scene with Ben Kingsley slightly sticks in my throat. But for the rest of it, the ghetto clearing scene, nobody has come close. The visceral terror of that, I don't know how long it lasts, 20 minutes, with Ralph Fiennes, he says, "Today history is made. These people have been here for 600 years. That ends today." And they rampage through all the tenements, throwing the suitcases over the verandas. And you think, this is a filmmaker who is absolutely got a mission in his mind at the peak of his powers, and I think it remains one of the great films. There's
only two movies I've been to where at the end of the movie nobody got up. One of them is Schindler's List, and perhaps coincidentally, the other one is Saving Private Ryan, both by Steven Spielberg. May I ask you about another book very quickly? I read it years ago. What do you think of it? And that is Hitler's Willing Executioners. Daniel
Goldhagen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What did you think of that book?
Oh, excessive. I think I was very taken aback. It was written in the mid-90s. I had made a film for BBC and for History Channel, A&E, about Albert Speer in 1995. And we interviewed Daniel Goldhagen's father, Eric Goldhagen. And he had been the person who had realized that Albert Speer had been at the infamous address given by Himmler in Posen in 1943, where he described the final solution in all its detail. So Albert Speer, the armaments minister who was spared the noose after the war, served 20 years in Spandau and then spent the rest of his life a best-selling author, a pundit on endless documentaries, self-invented as the more in sorrow than in anger. I was just the technocrat. I wasn't an ideological Nazi. And
the architect.
The architect, and he played that role to perfection until his alibis just got blown apart. And Eric Goldhagen was one. It was his son, Daniel, who wrote this book. And I think I read it with the same. The response to it at the time was that he overstated his case. So his case was that every single German was a latent, annihilatory anti-Semite, waiting simply for the slightest pretext in which they could start killing Jews. And what I've tried to do in my book is suggest, well, without saying, just say that's just not true. It was a tiny minority. It started off as a tiny minority, but by what mechanism did the rest of the German people get roped in at some level or another, even if it was simply to wave it on by as a bystander? What exactly was the process by which this happened? Because I think the thesis that every single German wanted nothing more than the chance to put into practice 600 years, and this is Martin Luther, whatever that 500 years of anti-Semitism, I think is not true. Because after 1945, it's never happening again. Nobody in 1950 is going, Germany is this close to doing another Holocaust. No, it's ridiculous. So I think what his book did was it gave a very powerful jolt. I think it put the Holocaust back in the headlines. And the mid-90s, when it happened, when it came out, was a very interesting period, because this was the moment when I think the West, Britain, America, France, Germany, was at its most, I hate to use the word complacent, but I think we were, the Berlin Wall had come down in 89. The Soviet
Cold War
Union
was over. Yep, that's right.
Yeah. And we were looking, and it was the absolute high watermark of international liberal politics. Democracy was on the march. And we have Francis Fukuyama, the historian, infamously with his End of History, that very tendentious line. We know what he meant. What he was saying is all the key fundamental arguments they've been had and answered. And yes, there will be small problems, but essentially we're on the way now. And that was the moment, I think it's no coincidence, that one way of measuring our progress as the liberal West was to reinvestigate the Holocaust. And I think that was the moment when a lot of, I remember, I think it was 92, 93, the Washington Holocaust Museum opened, the Berlin Jewish Museum opened, the Imperial War Museum in London had a great big Holocaust wing, Yad Vashem, completely remodernized and expanded. And I remember making a film about the opening of the Washington Holocaust Memorial, and also a film about this kid who designed the Berlin one. And they were citadels to celebrate how far we had traveled from the nadir of the war. So if the Jewish Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust, the mass murder, the genocide of the Jewish people, and obviously millions of others, it wasn't just the Jews, of course, that starting from that point, we were, you might say, we were at the peak of all the values that the Nazis had stood most against and most opposed. Everything about the Western world was anathema to the Nazis. The idea that there were human rights, that all humans had value, that xenophobia and all of that stuff was humanity at its worst. And the mid-90s was the high watermark of that. And I remember we'd go around those museums, and you weren't scared. You didn't visit the museums with the sense of, oh God, we're this close to it all happening again. You went there to survey the progress we'd made. And it felt good. You felt proud. I thought it was there. And then Goldhagen's book arrived, and I think it was very much part of that moment, just to really ram home just what a defining event the Final Solution was. But I think in doing it, I think he overstated. And the trouble with overstating it is you let the real process slip through your fingers, right? Because if these things can happen again, and it won't take a nation of 70 or 80 million, however many Germany, I think it was 69 million, all of whom want nothing more than the chance to kill Jews, for this to happen again. And if you think, so long as that doesn't happen, we're safe, and we realize that is not what makes the world safe.
You mentioned a few minutes ago, and I want to go back to it because it's very interesting how you pair them. And it's a theme through history. You focus on X, but you really should be focusing on X plus Y. So let me ask this question, and it's a broad question, so I apologize in advance. Did Hitler, and we've had several guests talk about Stephen Fritz. I just interviewed Brendan Sims.
Oh, yeah.
And so we've been lucky on the podcast to have a terrific cadre of World War II historians to answer this question. Do you think Hitler thought he could win the war? And do you think that Hitler thought massacring Jews was going to help him win the war?
Absolutely. I believe both with total conviction. In 1941, so let's say April, May 1941, there's a brilliant essay written by one of my favorite international historians, who's a Cambridge historian called David Reynolds. And he wrote this essay about how the fall of France is the pivotal event of the entire 20th century. And what he meant by that was that the fall of France in 6 weeks, the thing that should never have happened, is what seals our fate. Because that is the moment when Hitler has his megalomania proved. Up to that point, he's playing a part. He comes over, he is this man of iron will and total certainty and irresistible omniscience. It's after the fall of France that he himself completely believes it, that the combination of his military genius and the fighting spirit of the German army with its racial imperial mission to take over Europe, and from that grab onto a status as the world superpower. It will be, as Rome was to the ancient world, Germany will be to the 20th and 21st century, if not a millennium. And so he then has two choices. So after the fall of France in June 1940, two world cities still elude him. London to the west, gateway to America, the Atlantic, the British Empire. Moscow to the east, gateway to the Urals, the unbelievable bonanza of wheat and raw materials and coal and oil. And he's thinking he hasn't been able to knock Britain out of the war because the English Channel has made it impossible to invade Britain, and the Luftwaffe has been pretty much seen off by the RAF in the Battle of Britain. So there is a moment in sort of November, December 1940 where you thought, okay, maybe I stop now. I consolidate. I've got the whole of Europe at my feet. I haven't defeated Britain, but Britain can't do anything. Britain's not coming back anytime soon. Yes, there's the possibility of an alliance with America, but that'll take years. And the Soviet Union, at the moment, I have my non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. They're providing trainloads of raw materials. But someday down the line, obviously, we are such ideological enemies, I'm going to have to sort out Russia. And then he goes, actually, the Soviet Union, I am going to escalate and accelerate this war, far from just consolidating and stopping. He goes, I'm going to roll all the dice. And the reason he does it is he's convinced he'll win. And of all the decisions made in World War II, it's Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union that baffles us the most. And you think, are you insane? Obviously he was, but logistically and militarily, are you insane?
And not only that, is the fact that he invades Eastern Europe to get supplies, but he's already being supplied like crazy by the Soviets. So yes, the actual invasion cuts off the supplies he needs that is causing him to invade.
Exactly. But there are three things going through his mind. There's the short-term gain, middle-term, medium-term gain, and long-term gain, and all say attack Russia. The short-term gain is the paradoxical one. If he can defeat Moscow, he will defeat Britain. The way to isolate Britain and make Britain completely impotent is to have no possible continental ally, and America will have nothing to do with a Britain that is that isolated. It will be over. And Churchill can bloviate all he wants. He will be, the writing will be on the wall. And curiously, Hitler thinks that invading Russia is going to be easier. There's no English Channel. His tanks, open plain, his blitzkrieg armies, that's 3 million of the troops, that's what they're designed for. The medium-term aim is that once he's there, all that grain, raw material, it's what I call the energy wars. The energy wars take the form of food, calories for your workforce, slave labor for your factories, and oil and coal for your fuel. And the third long-term gain from defeating the Soviet Union will be that Germany will have, as America has its prairies, as the Roman Empire had North African breadbasket, will have such invincible supply of raw materials that it will become the great world power. It will be to the world of the 20th and 21st century what Britain was to the 19th century, what France was to the 18th, what Spain and Portugal were before that. And he is convinced, because France was the miracle. It should have been a 5-year slog, as it was in the First World War. He defeated them in 6 weeks. And compared to that, the Russian army is, in his view, no match. Stalin has slaughtered his senior officer cadres in the Great Purge of 1937. He genuinely thinks, and he's not the only one, the Americans, the British, the Japanese all agree that once he invades Russia, it'll be over in between 8 weeks and 3 months. And Hitler is absolutely convinced. It's a gamble, like everything he does. But and the way you can tell that is that all the planning they do, there's a brilliant book by an Australian historian called David Stahl. And what he does is he just lists the encyclopedia of mistaken assumptions that the Germans in their hubris and their complacency fail to understand about the Russian campaign that will be the reason they come unstuck. It's thousands of miles. There's no fuel. The roads are crap. The weather is terrible. The raw materials will not fall into their hands. There are partisans. It's an extraordinary read. But the thing he's most convinced about is that it will be the rotten stable door will be kicked in, and once that's happened, he will be invincible. And he's absolutely convinced they'll do it. They'll have done it by, I don't know, September 1941. It'll all be over.
One of the reasons why they didn't issue their troops, they issued the German troops plenty of speed, so they'd always be hyped up on drugs for the fight, but they didn't issue them any winter gear because they didn't think they would be there that long. But let me ask you one final question, and then we're going to get to the 5 questions that we ask all of our guests. Doesn't Hitler, besides the logistical problems that you just mentioned, and the fact that, for example, their blitzkrieg tank tactics just didn't work, they worked, but they weren't dispositive because of the size of Russia like they were in Poland or especially France. And they were having surrenders of whole Russian armies, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men. And it was immaterial. It was more of a burden for the Germans than it was a disaster for the Russians. But is it fair to say that Hitler's own policies that he demanded to be implemented after he invaded the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe were as big a cause of his defeat as anything else? In other words, could he have succeeded in his invasion of the Soviet Union if he had been less of a racial murderer?
It's a really fascinating question. I'm not an absolute military historian, but as I understand it, I think, like Napoleon, capturing Moscow is a red herring. I think he would never have won. There are moments when the Soviets, Stalin, is absolutely terrified they are about to lose. It's easy to over retrospect, to retcon this and go, it was inevitable from day one the Germans would lose. But the factors are so strong against German success, and the complacency and blind spots they operate under are so huge that it's extremely unlikely they'd have held on to the Soviet, and it certainly wouldn't have defeated they would have just retreated 500 miles behind the Urals like they'd done with Napoleon. But yes, did Hitler contribute? It's interesting. You talk about Stephen Fritz. I think isn't he the author of a book which argues the opposite, that actually Hitler was let down by his generals after the war? The German surviving generals all turned, and of course they blamed all the army mistakes on Hitler. Oh, the idiot! If it only let us. And Stephen Fritz, I think it is, if I'm not getting it wrong, wrote this fascinating book saying that actually isn't true. It had a much better grasp. But be that as it may, there is no question the things that did for them. France has petrol stations every 20 miles and paved roads. Russia has neither. Hitler was splitting the army into 3 across a 2,500 mile front, or however long. It was clearly insane. I leave it to the war gamers to decide, okay, should he just have done Army Group Center heading straight for Moscow and ignored Leningrad? He should certainly have ignored Stalingrad. That clearly ends up being the great graveyard. But the important thing is that by August and September 1941, the wheels are already falling off. Even Goebbels admits in his diary, this is what he calls it, no cakewalk. This is no cakewalk to Moscow. And it's no coincidence that it's exactly at that moment when the Germans have reached the end of their supply lines. And as David Stahel brilliantly outlines in his book, the Germans have arrived with something like 200, hundreds of different models of lorry and truck, because they've all been stolen from the French, the Czechs, the Poles. There are no spare parts. They can barely get enough fuel to the front. And also their tanks are breaking down. The attrition rate through breakdown is, you've got whole panzer divisions down to single number tanks.
And it's so cold, the oil is freezing within the vehicles. I just can't imagine that level.
I know. But it goes from blistering heat when they start, then the rains arrive, turns everything to mud, meters deep of mud in October, and then that all freezes. So Barbarossa is officially ended. I think it's October or November, and they then mount what they call a second attack called Operation Typhoon. And that does really well to start with, and that's the one that flounders outside Moscow, and it's all over. Along the way, you might ask the question, did they then dissipate all their military efforts by concentrating so much on all the mass shootings, because they're executing people left and centre by the hundreds of thousands? I suspect that wouldn't have made any difference, because shooting unarmed men, women, and children outside villages doesn't take much military effort. It takes a lot less military effort than taking trains and transporting them to concentration, which is why they do it. Mm-hmm. Why bother sending them? We're going to shoot them now. So I suspect there is a sort of rather weird question which goes, oh, if only Hitler hadn't had a Holocaust, he'd have won. And you think, first of all, he wouldn't. And secondly, there was no possibility of there being a distinction in his mind. The war, total victory, and the final solution were, in his mind, indissolubly locked. They were one and the same.
Perfect way to end the podcast before we get to the 5 questions. Perfect. And we are referencing the book, The First Soldier, and it's written by Stephen Fritz.
That's it. Yes.
The First Soldiers. Dr. Fritz came on the podcast and talked about it. He was a terrific guest. As we do with all of our guests, we ask the same 5 questions. Historian and documentarian, Mr. Davidson, Martin Davidson, are you ready? I promise these are easy.
Yeah.
At least they won't be graded. How about that? I don't know how easy they are. What was your first job?
My first job after university was, you mentioned J. Walter Thompson. I got a job as a college, as a graduate, an account trainee working in the JWT headquarters in London. So I then worked on the Kellogg's account. So I was the junior person on a team that dealt with Battle Creek, Michigan, and all the Kellogg's cereal. So this was in the mid 80s when we were in the middle of the bran revolution, the idea that what they call the F plant, it was all about fiber. And so I learned all about marketing and branding and corporate values, and a very exciting place, mid 80s in London, which was second only to New York as the great capital of advertising. It was great. I'm very sad to discover, because Mad Men, the great AMC series, is my favorite of the golden age of television. Love Mad Men, but I was very sad to discover JWT doesn't even exist anymore. It's gone. It vanished. I know, in 2019, it got swallowed by another company whose name, needless to say, I've forgotten. You think, why on earth would you get rid of that name? But anyways, poor old Commodore J. Walter Thompson's, he lives in the mists of history alone. But that was my first job.
Number 2, what was your first concert?
My first rock concert was the one I can absolutely remember, the biggest first one. The most fun was I visited, first time I ever came to America, 1979. I was 18, just about to go to university, and we were in New York, and I got taken to an Eddie and the Hot Rods punk concert in a subterranean club in New York City. This was just after the great Walter Hill movie Warriors had come out. And I remember the terror of using the New York subway because in those days it was all completely coated in graffiti. But my first really big concert was before that, was the prog rock group Genesis.
With Peter Gabriel?
No, Phil Collins had just taken over, and I remember going to see them with hair down to my nose, and I just thought this was the most important musical statement. It was just cosmically brilliant.
Genesis is brilliant. Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
What, about anything?
About anything.
About anything. Blimey, that's a very good book. Do you know what? I'm really embarrassed to say this, but I have started reading the Bible. And the reason for that was a really interesting book has just came out about 3 months ago called Why Did the Bible Begin? And it's a study of all the ancient civilizations why would the civilization that produced one of the most resonant books in history be the people who lost the most? They weren't the Assyrians or the ancient Egyptians who had mighty empires. This was this half of Canaan and Judea, this extraordinary civilization that emerged there. What was it about that civilization that produced, he's talking primarily about the Old Testament. And then there was a point I realized I did an English degree. So much of English literature is premised on knowledge of the Bible. I'd never read it. So I actually started reading the Old Testament, realizing it really is a newsreel. I had not appreciated the extent to which this was, if you like, the bio tapestry of an ancient civilization. And in that curious kind of way, the one civilization from that period of time you would least expect something of that permanence to come from when you think of the great imperial, extraordinary civilizations that surrounded it. That would be it. I'm finding it a fascinating exercise.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Oh, at the risk of sounding like I'm flogging a very dead horse, after seeing the great movie The Downfall, I really would have. I remember interviewing the historian Hugh Trevor Roper, who hit the bunker a few weeks after the end of the war in order to write a report about, and that has I hope it's not unhealthy, but a sort of kind of fascination. I just would have just to have felt what that level of sort of damnation would have felt like among those people now realizing the consequences of all their actions. So I think to have been there on the day he killed himself,
April 30th.
April 30th, I to have been a fly on the wall then would have been a morbidly fascinating experience.
I couldn't have witnessed. Yes, we've never had that answer, Martin, and that's a terrific answer. What I could not have witnessed was the execution of the Goebbels family. The kids.
Oh, no. Oh, God, no. Yes,
Number 5. Go ahead.
No, I agree. That was the moment in that movie, the great Downfall movie, where you simply drew breath. Actually, to see it happen like that, it's one of those things you knew happened, but you never paid any attention. Extraordinary.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
Wow, that's a fascinating. Do you know what? Because he occupies such a huge part of our brain space. Do you know what? I'm going to say Trump. I just think I would be fascinated to spend 2 hours trying to square the image we have of him with the reality. And I say that only because, not that I expect any particular kind of enlightenment, and it's not a political statement one way or the other. It's simply his is the face and the noise that takes up most bandwidth in the Western world at the moment. And I would be really interested to have come away thinking, yeah, I experienced that for 2 hours, and here's what it made me think.
And he is a popular answer. He is not the most frequent answer. The most frequent answer is Barack Obama. But I would love to buy President Trump a copy of a Kaiser Wilhelm II biography, maybe by Giles Magana, and say, look, this is who you remind me of. You remind me of this guy. Thank you for being a part of the podcast. You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today has been historian and documentarian Martin Davidson. We discussed 2 of his books. One is called The Perfect Nazi, Uncovering My Grandfather's Secret Past. And the other one is Mobilizing Hate, the Story of Hitler's Final Solution. Mr. Davidson, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I have to say I learned a lot. Your books are wonderful, and I hope you'll come on again.
My very great pleasure, and I look forward to doing exactly that. Thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.